Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Alyssa Plizzi.
And I'm Arran Rogerson.
Next week, Lisa Marciano, Jungian analyst and host of this Jungian Life podcast, will be joining us as our guest for the Shadowplay speaker series at the Stoa. Lisa is releasing a new book in May that dives into the emotional and symbolic journey of motherhood. So today we thought we'd explore the archetype of the mother.
Lisa will be here on Wednesday, March 3rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can RSVP at thestoa.ca. We've already had James Hollis meme analysis and John Beebe. So this will be the next part of the series. I'm really excited. The archetype of the mother is what we're going to explore today. That's pretty broad, and we're going to treat it pretty broadly as far as what the archetype of the mother means. And I think we'll probably start with talking about a little bit of the mythology surrounding the mother.
Yeah.
And maybe progress into a more sort of meta intellectual conversation about the archetype of the mother and what that means as we go.
Yeah, if you've listened to this Jungian Life podcast at all, you probably know that Lisa references fairy tales and myths quite a lot. And it's a big part of her work to kind of bring in that side of Jungian thought into everyday life, kind of making sense of mythology and fairy tales from a psychological perspective. And when she joins us next week, we'll be going into the shadow and initiation and transformation through the process of motherhood. So looking at these stories really gives us a lot of different varying angles of how the archetype of the mother is expressed through consciousness.
Right, so we're not exactly going to get into what it means to be a mother in a kind of like literal sense today. I don't think the conversation is really going to go in that direction. Neither of us have experience being mothers, not yet. So this is going to stick to being pretty abstract and pretty mythological, archetypal, kind of the patterns behind the patterns of motherhood, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The Great Mother is often what the mother archetype is referred to as, and I think it's got this real heaviness to it because it's encompassing a lot of different degrees of mothering. We have the cherishing, nourishing, emotionally connective, relationally oriented figure of the mother that we see. But there's also the kind of darker pole through the Great Mother, the devouring mother, the terrible, wrathful mother that we see. So when we speak of the Great Mother archetype, we're looking at both the kind of light side and the dark side, or just the bipoles of the two dynamics within the archetype.
Right, there's always a valence within these patterns. Every archetype is, I would say, neutral on its own in some sense. I mean, that can get kind of complicated. But there's kind of a valence to these patterns, right? And the notion that the mother has a valence where it can be this viewed as sort of this positive light side, but also viewed as sort of this negative dark side, or it can be viewed as a constructive, creative energy, but also a destructive and destroying energy. And so it's important to keep that in mind whenever you explore archetypes, whenever you explore these patterns, whenever you explore any kind of notion of an entity in the world that's at sort of the foundation of our psychology, of our existence. There's always sort of these ways in which that entity can fall out of balance, either towards the dark or towards the light. It can be a positive thing or a negative thing. So we're going to get into that.
So I think some of the classic figures of like the mother goddess that we tend to see, the Virgin Mary, Isis, Demeter, all of these figures who encompass on this first end more of that positive valence, you might say.
Yeah.
The Virgin Mary as the sort of mother goddess of Christianity, not only as the mother of Christ, but really, I think over time, as she really moved into the collective consciousness, became a figure in her own right that had her own worship. I don't want to call it a cult necessarily. It's kind of more Greek sounding, but followers, or people sort of feeling like they see the Virgin Mary kind of coming to them in all these different ways, or praying to her specifically, that she carries her own dynamic energy that connects us to this principle of creation, of divinity, of being that vessel of the Holy Ghost, you might say.
Yeah.
And she is one of the only really striking feminine figures that we do see in the Christian theology.
Right. I mean, I am coming from a place of ignorance on this, but I would wager that she is like the second most prominent figure in Christianity after Christ, obviously. And as you said, her depictions of her are seen throughout Christian tradition, throughout Christian art. There is sort of the, you might even call it a meme of people seeing the Virgin Mary, like they see like a splatter on the wall and it looks like the Virgin Mary.
Or in the grilled cheese.
And they take it as some sort of sign, something kind of holy. And because Mary has such a prominent presence in sort of the psyche of Christianity, or sort of the collective sort of mind of Christianity, you can tell that there's something actually deep and archetypal going on. It's not simply a figure that's being thrust upon people that has no deeper resonance or has no deeper significance. Like, it actually must be tapping into something that we intrinsically feel. What is Mary? Sort of this goddess of compassion, kind of goddess of goodwill, of purity, of the kind of the mother to the hero of Christ. Christ is very much like a heroic figure. Mary is the mother of Christ.
Yeah.
So it's obviously tapping into something that is archetypal and deep, that I think you can see reappearing in different cultures.
Yeah, there's so much like incredible feminine strength that's implied with Mary as well. It's like the implication of the virgin birth being something that just sort of is thrust upon you, and you sort of become destined to be the vessel of the holy manifestation of God, and then have to watch as her son sort of like rises into prominence and then is crucified.
Right.
So there's all of this deep anguish as well, and inner tenacity that's really required of Mary to be this figure, to have that strength, maybe God knew where this was going, and someone had to be chosen that could fulfill this role, that could be that strength for Jesus, but also could hold that pain and anguish after his death.
Right.
So there's so much depth to her. It's not just like she's demure and she could take, like what God was giving to her. I think that there's a real implication of just an incredible amount of strength within her, that deep feminine strength.
Right. So the archetypal mother, Mary, not only she conceives God incarnate, gives birth to God incarnate, like that's already heavy enough.
Yeah.
But she also kind of sacrifices her son to the world.
Right.
Like, she brings Christ into the world, and I think there's some sense that she even knows what's going to happen to Christ eventually, but she gives Christ to the world anyways.
Yeah.
And there is sort of that archetypal pattern of the mother giving their child to the world, like letting their child go eventually, and saying, like, I know that you are going to experience suffering and pain and death. Like, I'm having a child and I know the child is going to die someday, and yet I have the child anyways.
Yeah.
Like, that's true for every mother.
Yes.
So that kind of that pattern of the strength of the mother to not only bear the child, but to give the child to the world, and to, in some sense, sacrifice the child to the world.
Yeah, and to bear witness their fate, which is so difficult at times that it can cause that kind of undercurrent of the dark side, the sort of negative valence, where like the mother becomes devouring, or she withholds the child out of fear and anxiety. But to surpass that through the mother archetype is to let go and to bear witness to the fate of the child, to release them and know that you've done your best, and to let what will come upon the child. Right,
and to take on the burden of the pain of being a mother. I mean, there's the pain of birth, but there's also the pain of watching your child suffer, right?
Yeah.
And then there's this is going to be terrible if I'm getting this wrong, but the Pieta, right? That's Mary holding Jesus, the famous sculpture of Jesus has been crucified, and she's holding him. And so, like, that really is portraying the pain that a mother feels, that she not only brings a child into the world, which is painful, but she also watches as her child suffers, and that is like such a deep burden, such a deep pain, but it is like it is the way of the mother to do this.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Mary is such a powerful figure in all these ways of the figure that can take on the burden of Christ. Christ takes on the burden of the cross, but Mary takes on the burden of Christ, and like his pain is her pain as well. And that's like, that is the mother.
Yeah, there's, I think, a strong pattern of that we see with a lot of these main mother goddesses, of bearing the child and kind of suffering through some difficulty. You know, Isis is another good example of having to call upon a lot of that deep inner strength to be the anchoring that allows, you know, life to return in a way after some sort of difficulty or strife, or in the case of Osiris, her husband, who's effectively destroyed. She is the vessel of rebirth for him. And it's through her laboring and through her suffering of moving all around and finding like his scattered pieces along with her sister. So you have like another like anchoring of a dual feminine,
right,
that she can bring life back, that she can bring Osiris, and also she nurtures Horus. So it's like her son too. She heals him. She heals Osiris. She's carrying so much weight upon her shoulders, but that sometimes is the weight of the mother. It's the thankless job of keeping all of those things afloat.
Right. So the glue that holds the family together, the role of the mother as sort of being that more subtle, more delicate undercurrent of the family that keeps people stable and keeps people warm and fed and clothed. Mother as healer, like you can go to the mother to be healed. You go to the father to get structure and to get like direction and to get like a kick in the ass to kind of like get yourself in gear. But you go to the mother contrastingly to be healed, to be held, to get that rest. And the power for women to heal men, I think it's also sort of depicted in Isis, is like men can be lost in the world, they can be destroyed by the world, and they can be on this lonely path. But like a woman can bring a male, let's say, into manhood.
Yeah.
And that sort of the healing of Osiris, the patching them back together, I think, and kind of you can see the symbolism there.
Yeah, there is that sort of dynamism that I think we see with the feminine archetype especially, but even more pointed within the kind of great mother are these really interesting stories as they act as these vessels of initiation, as these kind of guardians almost, the kind of gatekeepers into some sort of deeper transformation. And the great mother archetype in these stories often is either like the healing vessel, or maybe a little bit more on that sort of darker valence, like something that's pressuring like the younger heroic consciousness or the young heroine to be forced into a situation, just as the guiding hand of the mother might need to do at times. It's like it's both nurturing, but at the same time trying to drive you towards initiation or transformation or maturation. And the feminine principle is doing it very, very differently. At times it's through healing. At other times it's through a type of challenge or forcing the individual to find their own inner power. It's very different than the type of more active principle of the masculine, of the father archetype, that's going to force transformation in a bit of a different way.
So Demeter and Persephone is a very classic myth, Greek myth.
Yeah.
It's led to a lot of like rituals and cults.
Yeah,
even,
well,
over time.
these two figures specifically are tied to the Eleusinian mysteries, which is still to this day incredibly mysterious because everything was kept under wraps. And what actually happened in these rites of passage and the initiations was kept inwardly within the cult itself, but it was based around the mythology of Demeter and Persephone, and that there was the kind of descent into the underworld, and at a certain point an ascent. So there was kind of like the lesser mysteries and all these different practices involved with the descent, and the greater mysteries involved with the ascent. And it ties in this really dynamic pairing of the mother and the maiden, and the earth principle, which is Demeter. She's the earth mother, the nourishing mother. She is the embodiment of agriculture and grain. She's the life-sustaining principle. And her daughter is Persephone, or Core, as it's sometimes called as well. And she is abducted by Hades, brought into the underworld, and it sets Demeter into this space of despair, total despair and loss. And she's wandering around the earth looking for Persephone. And as she does that, she's not really tending to her goddess duties of keeping the agriculture thriving. Plants are dying. Everything is withering around, and you see that this inherently deep grief that the mother can feel at the loss of a child, especially in a way that's so shocking and unexpected, causes not just her but nature itself to mourn. And so you start seeing life withering away as Persephone's taken into the underworld. But that can't stand, because basically everything is being destroyed. There's no way for civilization to sustain itself. So Zeus gets involved. They say, okay, Persephone has to be brought back to Demeter. Long story short, Persephone eats some pomegranate seeds while she is in Hades, while she's in the underworld, and that ties her still to the underworld for X number of months a year, like 6 months a year. But for the other 6 months, she gets to be reunited with her mother, and that's the kind of return of spring. So at the time of when Persephone is in the underworld, the seasons change, life withers, plants die, but she returns again, that renewal, the life cycle being connected to the mother, and life is born again when Persephone is returned to her mother.
Wow, what a deep myth. There's a lot of things going on there. There's like so many layers, like moments of like, oh, tell me more about that.
Yeah.
And it happened like 5 times during that. So it's interesting because Demeter as sort of like this great mother figure, there's almost like this, or part of what I'm gleaning from the myth is like this over-identification with raising a child or nourishing a child. And then when Persephone goes missing, that like she can't handle it and needs to like find a way to go get Persephone back.
Yes.
And she starts to neglect all her other duties because of that. And so this sort of over-identification with like, what is my identity? Like it is mother. It's like taking care of this child. And it's like, well, the child grows. The child becomes an adult eventually. That could be in the sense that the child becomes conscious, and maybe Hades is like a masculine force of consciousness in the sense of consciousness being sort of a masculine energy, but also possibly Hades representing just the masculine coming to mate with the child or take her into marriage, and the mother having to let go. Yes. So this sort of this pattern of motherhood, of like the arc of motherhood, of like you're a mother for a while, but it changes and it keeps changing, and eventually the child leaves, and then who are you now?
Yes.
So there's that at play, but there's also sort of the cyclical seasons changing, kind of like origin myth almost of like, why do the seasons change? Which is really, really heavy and deep, and it goes back to, you can see sort of like the most foundational aspects of our conscious understanding of the world, of like, why do things happen this way? Why is the earth what it is? What are the seasons? But you can also tie that to sort of like the cycle of mother giving birth to daughter, daughter becomes mother, mother gives birth to daughter, daughter becomes mother, and that kind of like that cyclical thing, that like motherhood is not only beginning and end thing. It's like, no, it keeps happening over and over and over again. Yeah. And the daughter always is confronted with becoming a mother, and the mother is always confronted with letting go of the daughter.
Yeah. Yeah. The entrance of the masculine principle is a loss ultimately to the mothering principle. Like she has to let go. And in this sense, there was a feeling that came too early, or it came unexpectedly. But ultimately, Persephone takes her place as queen of the underworld, and she provides a balance to the principle of Hades as the masculine. And she has a role to play in the underworld. She is not just kind of second fiddle to Hades. I would say that there are times when there are stories where she's interacting with other figures who come down. So she's a needed component. She's an evolution in that principle of death and the afterlife. And it's a difficult transition ultimately for Demeter, who we see in her grief and in her wandering, looking for something else to nourish. And you start to tap into, as you mentioned, that what happens when we become compulsively identified with the need to nourish and to mother. It's like that's when it becomes devouring. That's when children become stunted in their maturity. In some versions of the myth, Demeter comes upon a castle. She's dressed as an old woman. They bring her in to help nurse a child. And there's like 2 sons of the king and queen. And she wants to make one of the children immortal. And so she's nursing the child. And then she does what gods do, which is you feed him ambrosia and you put him into a fire and burn away his mortality. And as she's doing that, the mother comes in and freaks out. And Demeter was like, "What did you do? I was going to make him immortal." And anyways, the point is like she's trying to force that sense of her own definition of mothering onto someone else's child completely, because she's just looking to have some other form to ignite that feeling of being connected to the mother-child dyad, and she's struggling with that loss. So it's a very interesting nuance, I think, that does highlight that she is struggling with some of that shadow pull of the mother archetype, despite how powerfully she's revered and celebrated as this goddess of Mother Earth and of nature and being all loving. You see her nuance in the story as well.
Yeah, it's like a myth of balance. Like it returns to this notion of valence again, right? It's like Demeter is like incredibly powerful, but with that power requires a balance. It requires a stability. It requires a sort of learning how to let go of moments, or learning how to grasp at other moments. But that sort of lesson, that motherhood is something that is changing over time for you, and it starts somewhere and it goes somewhere, and there needs to be sort of a rolling with the flow of your life as a mother, understanding that where you were as a young mother is not where you're going to end up as an old mother, and kind of learning how to navigate those maybe confusing waters of loss that are associated with having a child. Yeah,
it's how you recognize that even as you step into this new chapter of life as a mother, that there will be points of challenge and kind of like your own initiation points into deeper motherhood through like different levels of it. Because you start out as like the younger mother, and maybe that's kind of where Demeter was initially before Persephone was abducted. And that kind of shows that like psychological challenge of letting the child go, letting them leave the nest.
Yeah.
Another Greek story I wanted to talk about was Achilles and his mother, Thetis. I'm not sure if I'm saying that. Maybe it's Thetis. But she's a nymph who marries a human king and gives birth to Achilles. And of course, with Achilles, there's the famous story that he's immortal, almost, because his mother wanted to protect him. And so there's kind of 2 versions of the story. You have version 1, which is just like Demeter, feed the child ambrosia, you burn away his mortality, but that she was like holding him by, the edge of the ankle and kind of burning him. And then the husband comes in and sees, it's actually like very similar to the Demeter story. And the husband like gets in the way and stops the child from being fully immortalized. And thus he has a vulnerability. In another version, Achilles is being dipped into the river Styx, which is one of the main rivers that runs into the underworld. So magic river, you dip him in, and holding him by the heel, Achilles' mom dips him in, and so he's left still with that one vulnerability. But sort of from an interesting psychological perspective, we see how Achilles' mother has this complete and total loving acceptance. She's pulling out that deeply mothering principle, that connection to the child, and it becomes like this psychic invulnerability that cloaks and wraps the child, and that creates this dynamic, powerful warrior. He's self-assured, he's confident, he's indestructible. At least he feels that way. And there's that sense that when you're raised and you gain that nurturing and that acceptance and that feeling of being bolstered by the mother principle, that the child feels that they can take on the world. And I think that's a very interesting angle of what's happening in Achilles' story.
Is Achilles' story a cautionary tale in any way? I mean, there's like the mother aspect of like making him like invulnerable.
Sure.
But is she in some way like responsible for him becoming overconfident and being too reckless and saying I am invincible, and then like he actually gets killed really easily?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's very important to keep in mind, because that sense of being kind of inflated with that love and that sense of like, you can do anything, son, without the caution or without to say, but you do have invulnerabilities, or watch out for this. The aspect that kind of humbles and grounds that that kind of inflating principle leaves the child in a space where they can be wounded. And in the case of Achilles, it's gravely, gravely wounded. There's an interesting quote from Freud, who apparently was like quite a mama's boy, like the firstborn child.
Was he?
Yeah.
Well, there's like an Oedipus complex. Is that what you mean? But
no, like his mother like loved him very dearly, and he was very cherished by his mother, and she would tell him, "Oh, you're going to do great things," and this and that. I was reading this in a book by Edward Edinger, so another very famous Jungian analyst, and he quotes Freud saying, "A man who has been the indisputable favorite of his mother keeps for life the feeling of a conqueror, that confidence of success that often induces real success."
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting to consider with Freud, who became this incredibly powerful, transformational figure in the world of psychiatry and then into psychoanalysis, really one of the pioneers of what we now know as modern therapy. And yet his tale is a cautionary tale, because he became so overly inflated with his theory that it caused these ruptures.
Right.
You know, very famously with Carl Jung, of course, also with Alfred Adler. There was the feeling like you have to follow the psychoanalytic tenets by the T, and if you don't, I don't want anything to do with you. So it's like that. It's like an interesting cautionary tale of what happens when one is so inflated with this feeling of success that they lose sight of what's real, or there's this kind of egotisticalness that blocks you from seeing certain realities, or just drives people away, or leaves you vulnerable to attack.
Pop culture injection, really quick. Harry Potter, like in the first book, like Voldemort is possessing Professor Quirrell, but Professor Quirrell cannot touch Harry Potter without his like skin burning and his body collapsing, because Harry's mother has given him this sort of like invisible magic protection.
That's true.
Which is like mother's love is
Mother's
like how it's
love,
described.
yes, yeah.
And it's like, it doesn't really make any sense. I can't remember like the actual explanation of like, well, wait, how does that work? But like, that's like very much like the Achilles thing.
I don't think they explain it.
I don't think they explain it, but they don't need to.
No, they don't need to. That kind of gives it that flair of like modern mythology.
Yeah.
It's like just the mother's love that makes him invulnerable against these certain darknesses from Voldemort.
Right. He's protected from evil because his mother loved him so dearly, and that she like gave her life to protect him.
Yeah.
And so he's forever like covered in like this invisible armor against Voldemort.
Okay, moving on, getting into a little bit more of that darker side of the great mother, Kali, I think is a really interesting figure, because in some ways we might call her like a bivalent figure of the great mother, because she is both Kali Mata, the dark mother, but she also is Kali Ma, Kali mother. So she's both loving and terrible. She's destructive, but she's regenerative. She's Mother Nature in all of her awesome power, which is life-giving and life-sustaining, and also devouring and destructive. She's usually like painted black, so it's like her black skin is representative of like the darkness from which everything was born.
Right.
So she kind of has like that like void mother symbology going on. So she's incredibly complex. Like I think in some areas she is worshipped more as that lighter mother, and in other areas worshipped more as that destructive mother. And that just shows you how complex these figures can be.
Right. So the void, or the darkness or emptiness, is from where everything comes, from everything returns. I was looking up Kali a little bit before this, and I did find her to be kind of like paradoxical.
Yes.
As sort of like this destroyer, but also like a creator, and like the mother who like chops off the heads of men. It's like that was like the image on Wikipedia. She's like standing on like men's dead bodies with a sword and like holding
super
it up.
Super badass. Yeah, she's so cool.
And also like the Kali is the feminine. The name, the word is actually like the feminine form of time, or it's like the changing aspect of nature that brings things to life or to death. So this kind of like cyclical notion again of like nature is like producing so much and also destroying so much. And that's what it does, like produce, destroy. And it's like happening, and it's way, way too powerful for you to ever control it.
Yeah. Kali is a good example of how a great mother can be complex. And sometimes it's much more obvious. Like I think with Demeter, it's a little bit more subtle. I think she's tends to be looked at a lot on that light side. But all of these really powerful archetypal figures really carry both of the valences within them. You just have to dig a little bit deeper to find it.
Yeah.
Baba Yaga is another one I wanted to talk about, kind of moving a little bit more into Baba Yaga, more into fairy tale lore. So you see Baba Yaga in lots of like Slavic, Russian folk tales. She's like the chthonic dark mother goddess. She lives in like a house that's on chicken bones, and she like flies around in like a mortar and pestle. She's usually like very witchy and you know, like looks like that very classic like big scary ugly witch woman, but she's deeply powerful. She is another symbol of the nature goddess. She possesses the powers of life and death. In certain fairy tales, it's noted that she controls the sunset and the sunrise, like the power of the cycles of nature are under her control. And she can provide heroes and heroines with the power to sort of overcome their challenges or their main journeys, but she also often is like threatening them at the same time. Like in Vasilisa, the beautiful or the wise, as it's sometimes called, Vasilisa has to do all these like really ridiculous tasks that are like impossible to do. And should she do it, then Baba Yaga will help her. But it's like, if not, I'm going to eat you, you know? So there's this feeling that the dark feminine is going to destroy you. And to survive, you have to transform. You have to become stronger. You have to become smarter. You have to find some sort of inner power. And when you do, when you pass her tests, then you're given the fire. Then you're given like this magical horse that's going to help you beat, you know, this monster. These are actually directly from the fairy tale. So she's both devouring and life generating. She is a principle of transformation, but she will also destroy you. So she's very complex in that way.
Right. But she represents like the only path towards growth and development and towards individuation. The whole idea is like out in nature is where the change is and where the growth is, where you can achieve something, where you can become the person you're meant to be. Out in the wild, and that can be like a metaphorical wild, which is just like out of your comfort zone. Like you have to venture into the wild, into the unknown, in order to actually become the person you're meant to be, in order to transform. The whole idea of like the dragon of chaos is where the treasure is, right? You have to go venture and slay the dragon in order to get to the treasure. And so Baba Yaga is sort of embodying that idea, is like, here's some ridiculous tasks for you to achieve, and if you don't achieve them, I will destroy you, just like nature. But through the tasks are like the ultimate prize. Same with like sort of the notion of the development of consciousness being this sort of venturing back and forth into the unconscious, sort of consciousness, unconscious, consciousness, unconscious, like the hero doing that cycle. And it's like this upward ascending spiral of individuation. I had another thought, but I can't remember what it was.
I think especially you're reminding me of the conversation we were having about the wounded healer, where the kind of archetype of the shaman will at times choose to go out into the wild.
Exactly.
And this is your path towards being initiated into a deeper place of service, into finding inner strength, to triggering some sort of act of individuation that prepares you for this next cycle. And it's by going out and subjecting yourself to the elements, which could very well kill you.
Yeah.
But if you don't die, something major happens. You are changed on a deeply spiritual level. Consciousness shifts, and that's the principle of Baba Yaga. She is that wild, natural principle that is forcing individuation for any consciousness that comes her way.
Right. The other thought I had was that Baba Yaga could represent sort of like the dark feminine in sort of like the non-good mother figure in your life that comes along and actually brings you into womanhood in a different way.
Interesting.
Like saying like the good mother, like maybe your mother is someone who protects you and nurtures you and says like everything's going to be just fine. Like you're my like special little girl, my special little boy. But then like there's this exposure. Maybe if you're female, exposure to like your new female friends who might be more mature than you and might be experimenting with things like alcohol or boys, and like they bring you into womanhood, even though they kind of represent like the dark, dangerous unknown. And maybe the good mother is like, no, wait, don't go out there. But it's like you have to go out there in order to like achieve completeness, or to like the young man, the dark feminine. Maybe, I mean, I guess Baba Yaga is like an old woman, but the idea that like exposure to girls, like you leave your own mother to go seek out a woman in your life who maybe will corrupt you, but it actually brings you into manhood, like that corruption in some sense.
Yeah, there's the Maiden Tsar. That's a really famous Russian fairy tale as well, where you have the hero Ivan, who has to visit 3 different Baba Yagas. Sometimes they come in 3, like they're 3 sisters. And he has to deal with that same principle of like, you have to beat the Baba Yaga in some way, and then you can get to your fiance that like is all the way across the world. So he's also having to go through the challenge points of the Baba Yaga through the dark feminine to be worthy enough really to be joined with his feminine half.
Interesting. Also, more thoughts keep emerging from this, but like the idea that like the young man, like in order to have a good relationship with his fiance or the woman, he actually has to dive down into unconsciousness,
right?
Or he has to get more in touch with his feminine side, you might say, in order to understand his partner.
Yeah.
To be like, why are you so weird and different and subtle and mysterious? Like, I'm confused by the female,
right?
And like getting in touch with the feminine, getting in touch with the unconscious side of you. It might even mean getting in touch with your feelings and your vulnerability. That's key to becoming a real man.
Right.
It's like to also embrace the feminine in some sense and to understand it.
Yes.
So having to go through Baba Yaga as sort of like the feminine energy as such, or like the dark feminine.
Yeah.
It's like the male has to do that in order to understand the feminine, in order to become the perfect partner for the young woman or the maiden. And so there's like this paradoxical, again, it's like dipping into the feminine actually makes you more masculine.
Yes.
And then this like cycle of bouncing off. Anyways, so.
Well, from a psychological point of view, these fairy tales, the myths, are often looked at as the merging of a sort of single individual's masculine and feminine principles. So Ivan in the Maiden Tsar has to go through, as you're saying, that kind of unconscious, dark, chthonic feminine, learn the ways of something much more primordial to realize his own feminine side. And that's what is imaged as the fiance. So we always have like, and then the prince and the princess got married happily ever after. It's like that's a principle of individuation. That's masculine and feminine principles coming into relation together and coming into harmony. So it is his own feminine that's imaged as the fiance, as the love, as the anima figure, because we as individuals need to get in touch with both sides of our own dual nature to be more of a complete version of ourself.
Okay, so should we move on to pop culture, modern myths?
Yeah.
Maybe a little more familiar, maybe not. Depends who you are, who's listening. But Galadriel in Lord of the Rings strikes me as sort of a great mother figure to the Fellowship and to Middle Earth in general. She is a protector. She has one of the Rings of Power. They don't talk about that much in the movie, but she does have one of the Rings of Power, and it allows her to like protect the entire forest realm of Lothlorien and serve as like this queen. And she can read minds. She has this like crazy empathy and this crazy ability to like intuitively see what's really going on under the surface. She also provides all these gifts to the Fellowship before they set off to continue their journey. And so it's like very motherly. Like she takes them in, she protects them, she sees what's really going on, and then she like packs them lunches basically for them, and they keep going on their journey. But in addition to that, she also has like the dark feminine moment.
Yeah, she's bivalent, definitely.
Right. Where
I am beautiful and powerful.
Yeah.
Or whatever. She's so cool.
Yeah. And her voice drops.
Yeah. And like the colors change, and you just see that like if you fuck with Galadriel, she will destroy you.
Right.
So the Great Mother has the potential for great destruction.
Right.
And that's what every mother is really balancing within her, is staying in flow with that life-giving, nurturing principle, but also becoming like the angry, violent mother bear that has to destroy what is threatening.
Right.
And you see that, in Galadriel, she has that power for darkness.
Right. And also sort of communicates this idea that she's actually really in touch with the unconscious, or she's really in touch with the darkness, right? Like you don't see Elrond like going like crazy, like dark masculine or something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe that interpretation is fair, maybe it's not, but Galadriel like does represent like someone who is in touch with like the netherworld or the dark side.
More powerful than Elrond, isn't she?
It's depicted that way, definitely. Even though Elrond also has a ring of power, supposedly. That's all part of the lore.
Yeah,
probably sound like a huge nerd because I know this. But anyways, Catelyn Stark.
Yeah.
And Cersei.
Game of Thrones.
They're not the only mothers in the series, but they're two very prominent figures in the story. Catelyn Stark is the mother of the Stark children. So she plays this role in all these different plot lines. She's, Robb's mother, and she's Sansa and Arya's mother, but she's also kind of Jon's like anti-mother some weird sense.
Yes, she's very dark mother towards Jon.
Right. So she's embodying all this like protective energy. She's doing it in this very motherly way where she doesn't pick up a sword or anything, but she still is like roaming around, and she's taking care of important business, and she's making contact.
She taps into more of that feminine principle of like diplomacy or intrigue or influence. You know what I mean? Like she's wielding power in a much less active way, yet is still an incredibly important player throughout all of the storylines. And it's the mother principle that drives everything. It's for the safety of her children. It's for the continuation of her house, that she is willing to do what it takes to keep her children in the game effectively.
Right.
That is one of her main really identifications in the story. Spoiler alert, when she dies and becomes Lady Stoneheart, only in the books if you've read it.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting contrast because you see like her become the like chthonic underworld version of the vengeful mother. Yeah. She roams around with like a band of, I don't know, like warriors, and it's just
the Brotherhood.
The Brotherhood, right? Yeah. And she's like just like killing everyone in her path who she thinks had a role, because she believes that, that both Sansa and Arya were killed. Yeah. So it's incredibly interesting to see her dip into that really dark feminine upon her death, which is a psychological transformation.
Right. And there's kind of like the Mary archetype coming up again. Right. She's sacrificing her children to the world in some sense. Yeah. Like she is like accompanying Robb as he goes off to war. True. And she knows that he has to do it and he might die, but she accompanies him anyways and stands by him and kind of provides this like motherly wisdom behind the scenes as Robb fights these wars. Yeah. And then it turns out almost, not all of them, but like the Stark sons die, and that's part of her burden. Yeah, she has to watch her son Robb be murdered. Yeah, and so again, there's sort of like this very sacrificial taking on the son takes on the cross, and you take on the son. Yeah, and that pain. Right, she watches him die first before she's killed, and in the show specifically, they just did such a good job with showing the anguish. She lets out this just banshee like scream, and then they slit her throat. You know, it's incredibly powerful, really depicting that pain of the mother and having to let her son go as she loses her own life. Right. I feel like we need to be better about saying spoiler alert. Like, you did say it, but like I feel like we dove into like some really heavy revelations about Game of Thrones like pretty quickly.
Oh my god.
Anyways, we'll try to do better
guys.
next time. Spoiler alerts. We're going to continue with spoilers. Cersei, in contrast.
Spoiler alert for anything we're about to say.
Yeah. Cersei is in contrast to Catelyn Stark, is like still a very strong feminine figure, and she's like more kind of like the yang feminine, where she's like wielding real concrete power, and she's like murdering people,
making big
and
moves.
she's scheming very intelligently, but she's still doing so in this very feminine way, which is sort of like behind the scenes, sort of like underneath what's happening. She's sort of like this spider, like weaving this big web that people are getting caught in. She's also using her body to sort of manipulate people and get her way. She's seducing men. Yeah. And so it's like this whole other side of the feminine that's like still incredibly powerful, still incredibly protective of her children, right? Like she's like very driven to protect her children the entire time. That's like a lot of what she's doing. Yeah. But it provides kind of like this contrast of like the negative valence in some sense of the mother.
Yeah, but at the core, they're driven by pretty much the same thing. Because for how selfish Cersei is or seems or is depicted, ultimately the complexity of her character is the deep maternal love that she has for her children. Yeah. And also, spoiler alert, that it's prophesized that like they're all going to die, right? Is that what happens, right? So she's like living with this fear her entire life.
That's the Mary thing again.
Yeah. Right. It's like, how do you live with that? And especially in a world where like magic is real pretty much. And a sorcerer is saying like all your children are going to die. It's like she still pushes forward and she has an incredible impact on that story.
How about Ursula from The Little Mermaid?
Lots of like dark mother goddesses in the Disney princess stories, Maleficent, Ursula. They're these figures who embody the darkness, who embody the kind of wrathful feminine, yet through all of it is the maiden consciousness, the princess being forced into situations where they must overcome or where they're having to kind of walk this path of individuation that has been set. So I see them as like very similar to the kind of Baba Yaga figures in the fairy tales. Yeah. Mostly because all of these stories, for the most part, are actual fairy tales, thus turned into Disney movies. Yeah. But, you know, Ursula is interesting because she takes away Ariel's voice. At least we'll talk about just the movie version and not the actual fairy tale version. But there's a feeling of that Ursula is taking something from the maiden that she identifies with, something that would actually maybe be an easier path towards joining with the masculine, with the prince. And she's got to find these other ways. She's got to tap into new potentialities for that maiden young consciousness to grow and then to be sort of worthy enough to be joined through that sort of conjunctio, the conjunction of the masculine and the feminine. And it's coming through that dark, you know, witchy woman who's got the magic, who's taking from the feminine, yet at the same time is actually providing her a path towards growth, towards maturation.
Right. The Disney movies are great examples of exploring the heroine's journey.
Yes.
Which I think is really interesting. Because you actually don't see the heroine's journey being explored as much in other media.
We want to get to an episode on that. Yeah. It's in the list, but often the heroine's journey is a lot about the confrontations with the feminine principle, and often the turning away of the feminine principle or the interaction with the thought kind of dark feminine or some sort of greater primordial feminine that they really have to come into relationship with, because that is the guardian towards their deeper maturation, that older principle that understand what it takes for the younger consciousness to be kind of initiated and ushered into development is always through that deeper, powerful, sometimes punishing feminine principle. And that's a big part of that heroine's journey.
Right. The Disney movies, I mean, definitely depict the heroine's journey as sort of a turning inward. There's kind of more of like a journey into the unconscious. That is more sort of a cerebral, psychological journey of development, as opposed to the masculine hero's journey, which is one that's very much like going outward, like very like literally traveling across the land to go conquer chaos in a different way, or journey into the netherworld or unconscious. The analogy for men is like the chaos of the unconscious is instead like a real dragon that must be defeated. So they parallel each other, but they're a little bit different. And the heroine's journey, at least in Disney movies, is like the journey towards motherhood, essentially. And that might be honestly why the sort of that story has fallen out of fashion, because it's like, what's the female hero's journey? It's like, it's the journey towards being a mom,
right?
And it's like, we don't really feel as strongly about that as being the truth anymore.
Feels traditional or old fashioned,
right.
But there's more to it, I would say, both on like a deeper symbolic and psychological level, but also ultimately, and hopefully what we'll get into with Lisa's event next week is like how powerful motherhood is for a woman, just as for a man. The principle of tapping into the father, there's in some ways no greater challenge than that, and that is something that can't be denied.
All right, how about the Oracle from the Matrix? That's an interesting one, right?
Yeah, AI great mother archetype at play. She, I think, maybe isn't a character that would come to mind for a lot of people, but you start to look at the subtlety of the space that she holds, this kind of communal orphanage of all these special children that she's nurturing and tending to and kind of guiding them towards, I don't know, tapping into their power. She's baking cookies.
Bending spoons. And floating blocks in the air. And stuff like that. I can't remember what they call them, but
I don't know.
But she's bringing people into personhood. These children, and she's like raising them up in some sense. And, it's very vague what's actually going on.
Yeah.
But she sees like, the humans who have made it out of the Matrix and are traveling back in, like Neo and Morpheus and Trinity. She's also serving a role of guiding them and providing wisdom and having this sort of like, again, this sort of feminine connection to the unconscious, where it's like, I can see the future and I intuitively know what's going to happen, and I know what's happening inside of you. In fact, I know what you're going to do next. You're going to break that vase, and like Neo breaks the vase. It's like, how do you know all this stuff? And it's like, just like women's intuition, basically.
But it's fascinating to me because she's a program, right? Like, she's not real. So there's this feeling.
What is real?
Right. Yeah.
How do you define
Matrix.
real? Sorry.
But this idea that there's a kind of like rogue program of the Matrix that still is tapping into something that we would consider so inherently human is being expressed through the Oracle. And that kind of just shows you like the impulse for the archetypal great mother to be expressed even in this story, and then to give it complexity by making her not a robot, but a program, whatever, so she's still guiding in a way that's powerful and soft. She doesn't overly nurture, she tells each individual what they need to hear, which for like Neo, spoiler alert, is that you're not the one.
Yeah.
If you need a spoiler alert for the Matrix, I don't know what's going on, but now I feel compelled to say that.
No,
anyway,
good.
Spoiler alert, Neo, you're not the one. But that wasn't necessarily the truth. But it was the truth that he needed to hear. So that brings into mind that difficult role of mothering, of how to give lessons to the children so that they grow into the versions of themselves that they're destined to be.
Right. So like a father figure might just like drop like mad truth bombs and be like, here's the deal, Neo, you are the one actually, and you need to like get your shit together.
He's like, oh my God, I just like can't handle it.
Yeah. Like, so you're the one, we're going to come up with a plan now. Okay. So like sit down, son.
So like Father Oracle will be like, okay, training program, let's go. Like, toughen you up.
Right.
But like, the Mother Oracle,
she like does like this more subtle sort of like playing with the currents of like reality in some sense of like, are you the one? Sorry, kid. But like she actually knows that she's setting him on like the right path. He just doesn't know it. And she has that sort of intuitive, again, connection to the unconscious in order to manipulate these energies in some way.
Yeah. And then she gives him a cookie.
The most motherly thing of all.
Mothers know that they're these symbols of nurturance.
Yeah.
As someone who loves to cook, like I appreciate it because there is this sense of she's offering him something in that moment. And that's a piece of a comfort, a symbol of something known, maybe something his mother gave him when he was a child. There's some bad news, but there's also a feeling of like, I care for you, like I take care of you.
Yeah.
And then she sends him off to complete his tasks.
Okay, so on Wednesday, again, March 3rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Lisa Marciano of This Jungian Life podcast. She's a Jungian analyst and author.
Yep.
This is not her first book, right?
I think it is, and it's coming out in May, so you should pre-order it. Her work is great. Check out the podcast, 3 Jungian analysts who talk about all sorts of dynamic, interesting topics.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to make a connection with her and see if there's any resonance there. Yeah. But the event is free. Yep. We'd love to have you. You can RSVP at thestoa.ca. If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze? Head over to goldenshadow.org to submit your dream for possible interpretation on a future episode.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time.